The conference room buzzed with muted conversation as Thomas Laird, 46, CEO of Skyline Technologies, stood at the head of a gleaming oak table. Outside, the Manhattan skyline sparkled, but inside, all eyes were on him. Thomas thrived in this setting, commanding, sharp, and undeniably successful. He adjusted his tailored navy suit and clicked to the final slide of his presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his rich baritone resonating in the room, "this partnership with Nexus Solutions isn't just a deal, it's a revolution. By merging their AI analytics with their infrastructure, Skyline will redefine urban planning for the next decade." The applause was immediate. Investors shook hands and exchanged approving nods, their enthusiasm a testament to Thomas's visionary leadership. As he stepped back from the spotlight, his assistant Claire approached with a tablet. "Another triumph, Mr. Laird," she said, her voice laced with genuine admiration. "Another step forward, Claire," he replied with a modest smile. "Prepare the press release and make sure the team knows this was their win as much as mine." By the time he returned to his office, the adrenaline of success had begun to wane. He sank into his leather chair and swiveled to face the panoramic view of the city. His phone buzzed on the desk. Amelia, his wife of 18 years. Amelia. "Just landed at Mom and Dad's. Call ya after dinner." Thomas read the message twice, something tugging at the edge of his mind. Her flight to Connecticut was scheduled for later that evening, yet this message suggested she had arrived earlier. A trivial mistake, perhaps, but Amelia rarely got such details wrong. She was meticulous, the glue that held their family together despite his relentless schedule. Thomas read the message twice, something tugging at the edge of his mind. Her flight to Connecticut was scheduled for later that evening, yet this message suggested she had arrived earlier. A trivial mistake, perhaps, but Amelia rarely got such details wrong. She was meticulous, the glue that held their family together despite his relentless schedule. He shook off the unease and focused on the next task, reviewing the details for their upcoming anniversary gala. It was Amelia's idea to host the celebration at the luxurious Bellwood Hotel. "You've worked so hard, Thomas," she had said. "It's time we celebrate everything we've built together." He thought back to that conversation, to her radiant smile that had momentarily erased the tensions of work. But now, as he prepared for the evening ahead, that smile felt faintly performative, an unsettling thought he quickly dismissed. The gala that evening was a spectacle. The Bellwood's grand ballroom shimmered with golden light, the clink of crystal glasses mingling with the hum of conversation. High-profile guests from the tech world, politicians, and even a few celebrities mingled in their finest attire. Amelia, in an emerald green gown, was the picture of elegance as she moved gracefully between groups of guests, her laughter ringing out like music. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding him. Each time he approached, she seemed conveniently occupied. "Thomas, my friend," called out Marcus Trent, Skyline's CFO and his closest confidant, "another smashing victory today. Let me steal you for a drink." Reluctantly, Thomas allowed himself to be led to the bar. Marcus ordered 2 scotches, raising his glass in a toast. "To Skyline's continued dominance, and to you, the mastermind behind it all." As they drank, Marcus leaned in, his jovial demeanor darkening slightly. "By the way, I've been meaning to ask, did you approve the asset transfer to Nexus's offshore entity last quarter? The paperwork didn't seem like your usual style." Thomas frowned. "What transfer? I haven't touched anything related to their offshore holdings." Marcus's brow furrowed. But before Thomas could press further, Amelia's laughter drew his attention. She stood by the ballroom's French doors, speaking with someone he didn't recognize, a man whose hand lingered just a fraction too long on her arm. "I'll check on that tomorrow," Thomas murmured, setting his drink down and excusing himself. Later that night, as the party wound down, Thomas and Amelia returned to their suite at the Bellwood. She looked stunning, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her perfume intoxicating. Yet the warmth between them felt forced, like a fire struggling to reignite. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, placing a hand on his chest. "And I you," he replied, though the words felt hollow. When Amelia excused herself to make a quick call, Thomas found himself wandering the suite. Her phone lay charging on the desk, its screen lighting up with a notification. He didn't mean to look, but the name caught his eye. KL, room 1012. Can't wait to see you. The knot of unease tightened in his chest. Thomas stared at the message, his mind racing. Amelia re-entered the room moments later, her smile as radiant as ever. "Who's Kyle?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Her smile faltered. "Just a client, why?" He didn't press her then, but suspicion had taken root, and Thomas Laird never ignored the signs. The next morning, Thomas awoke to a familiar emptiness in the suite's king-size bed. Amelia had left early, her side of the mattress already cold. A neatly folded note rested on her pillow. "Brunch with some old friends, back by noon. Love you." Thomas stared at the elegant script, a sour taste in his mouth. He had replayed the previous night's discovery over and over, the text message from KL, and her nonchalant dismissal of it gnawed at him. He had built his career on reading between the lines, analyzing every detail until a solution emerged. The same instincts now whispered that Amelia's explanation didn't add up. Sliding out of bed, Thomas retrieved his phone and opened his private account. He had installed tracking software months ago, not because he suspected Amelia of anything, but because it was standard protocol for someone in his position. Security came first, even in the personal realm. Amelia's phone pinged from the Bellwood Hotel, not the main dining room, but from a private suite several floors below, Suite 1012. Thomas arrived at his office later than usual, his mood dark. Claire greeted him with her usual efficiency, handing him a stack of documents for review. He barely glanced at them. "Schedule a meeting with Marcus for later today," he said, his tone clipped. Claire hesitated. "Marcus left early this morning. He mentioned a personal matter. Did he say where he was going?" She shook her head. "Just that he'd be out of the office for a few days." Thomas nodded curtly, though the timing unsettled him. He dismissed Claire and sank into his chair, staring at the documents Marcus had mentioned at the gala. The asset transfer to Nexus Solutions. The file felt heavier than its physical weight. Buried within pages of legal jargon was the approval signature, his own, perfectly forged. His pulse quickened. For years, Marcus had been his right-hand man, his confidant, the one person Thomas trusted implicitly with Skyline's financial future. But this betrayal was clear, and it wasn't isolated. Thomas opened Skyline's internal systems and started pulling transaction records. Patterns emerged almost immediately. Small amounts siphoned off from various projects, rerouted to shell accounts in the Caymans. The sums were negligible on their own, but together they painted a troubling picture. And then there were Amelia's expenses. Lavish dinners, luxury hotel stays, on dates that coincided suspiciously with his travel schedule. By evening, Thomas sat in his study at home, surrounded by files and a growing storm of questions. Amelia returned, her smile radiant, but her eyes didn't meet his. "How was brunch?" he asked casually, watching her closely. "Lovely," she replied, slipping off her heels. "Sandra and I reminisced about college. You know how she loved to bring up those wild days." Thomas smiled faintly. "I bet. How's her husband?" "Same as always," Amelia said with a small laugh, already moving toward the bedroom. "You coming to bed?" "In a bit," he murmured. When she disappeared down the hallway, he opened his laptop. The Bellwood security footage was already queued. He had called in a favor earlier in the day, leveraging Skyline's partnership with a hotel chain. Suite 1012 showed exactly what he'd feared: Amelia entering late in the morning, accompanied by a man. The grainy footage didn't reveal much, but Thomas recognized the figure immediately: Marcus Trent. Thomas felt his grip on the glass of bourbon tighten as he replayed the footage. Marcus, his trusted CFO, and Amelia, his wife. The depth of their betrayal began to crystallize. Still, it wasn't just personal. It was professional. Their connection explained too much. Marcus had facilitated the asset transfer, but it wasn't for Nexus Solutions. The funds were rerouted, feeding a company Thomas had never heard of, Verdix Innovations. A quick search revealed the truth. Verdix was a direct competitor, poised to launch a suspiciously similar AI platform. Thomas's stomach churned. His closest confidant and the woman he'd built his life with were dismantling his empire piece by piece. Over the next few days, Thomas maintained a facade of normalcy. He attended meetings, approved contracts, and even shared pleasant dinners with Amelia. But beneath the surface, he was building a counterattack. First, he hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Amelia and Marcus's activities. The results came quickly: clandestine meetings at luxury hotels, shadowy connections to Vertex Innovations, and communications between the two that suggested a years-long affair. Amelia wasn't just a passive participant. She was deeply involved in Marcus's schemes. But it wasn't just Marcus. The investigator uncovered another collaborator: David Keene, a senior developer at Skyline. David had been leaking proprietary code to Vertex for months, paid handsomely through the same shell accounts Marcus had established. The break came during a corporate dinner 2 weeks later. Marcus, newly returned from his personal matter, greeted Thomas with his usual charm. "Apologies for the absence," Marcus said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "Family emergency." Thomas smiled tightly. "Of course. Family always comes first." As the evening wore on, Thomas cornered David near the bar. The young developer, clearly uneasy under Thomas's scrutiny, fidgeted with his drink. "I hear Vertex is making big moves," Thomas said casually. "Rumor has it their new platform could rival ours." David's hand shook slightly, spilling a bit of his drink. "I wouldn't know. I don't keep up with competitors much." Thomas leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Don't lie to me, David. I know about the code." David's face paled, and he stammered, I didn't have a choice." Marcus said." "Enough," Thomas said sharply. "You'll be hearing from my legal team." As David stumbled away, Thomas's plan solidified. He wouldn't just expose the betrayal, he would dismantle their entire scheme. Back at home, Amelia greeted him with a glass of wine and a kiss. He accepted both, though his mind was elsewhere. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting beside him, "we should take a vacation soon. Just us." Thomas smiled faintly. "That sounds perfect." But in his mind, he was already picturing the press conference he'd scheduled for the following week. By then, Amelia and Marcus's betrayal would be public knowledge, and Skyline's board would have no choice but to back his plan. In the quiet of their home that night, Thomas stared at Amelia as she slept, her face peaceful, untroubled. His heart ached, but his resolve was firm. They had underestimated him, assuming his love and trust would blind him to their treachery. But Thomas Laird hadn't built his empire by ignoring the signs. He had built it by reading every detail, finding every flaw, and then fixing it. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The day of reckoning began with an unassuming sunrise. Thomas Laird stood by the large window of his penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The weight of what lay ahead pressed against his chest, but he welcomed it. Today, the lies, manipulation, and betrayal would finally be laid bare. The strategy had taken weeks to refine. He had spent countless hours poring over evidence, crafting a response that was both methodical and devastating. It was not enough to reveal Amelia and Marcus's treachery. Their network of deception had to be dismantled entirely. There could be no loose ends, no escape for those who had sought to destroy him. At Skyline Technologies, the tension was palpable. The quarterly leadership meeting, a carefully orchestrated session Thomas had planned, brought every department head, key investor, and board member into the same room. Marcus arrived early, his usual charm on full display. He worked the room effortlessly, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. Thomas observed from a distance, his face impassive. Marcus leaned in to speak with David Keene, the developer caught leaking Skyline's code. Their hushed conversation and the uneasy glances they cast toward Thomas did not go unnoticed. Amelia, impeccably dressed in a fitted gray suit, arrived minutes later. She exuded confidence, her smile magnetic as she greeted familiar faces. She avoided Thomas entirely, choosing to sit near Marcus instead. Watching her, Thomas felt a pang of sorrow beneath his cold resolve. He had loved her once, deeply, but that love was now tempered by the knowledge of her betrayal and the damage she had helped orchestrate. As the meeting began, Thomas took his place at the head of the table. The room quieted, all eyes on him. He opened with the standard agenda, addressing financial performance, upcoming projects, and a summary of Skyline's successes over the last quarter. Midway through his presentation, he paused. "Before we move forward, there's another matter that needs to be addressed." His tone was measured, but the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Amelia's smile froze. After just a few months, Skyline Technologies has been the target of an orchestrated campaign of internal sabotage. Thomas's voice remained calm, but his words cut through the room like a blade. Critical data has been leaked. Funds misappropriated and confidential projects compromised. Gasps rippled through the table. Amelia's knuckles whitened as she gripped her pen. Marcus's eyes darted toward the exit, calculating the fastest way out. "To uncover the truth, I authorized a full internal investigation," Thomas continued. "What we found is damning." He gestured to the large screen at the front of the room. A slideshow began displaying emails, financial transactions, and surveillance footage. Each frame added a piece to the puzzle. Marcus forging Thomas's signature on financial documents, David Keene transferring code to Vertex Innovations, and Amelia entering and exiting hotels with Marcus. The final slide displayed a web of connections between Marcus, Amelia, and Vertex, a detailed flow chart that laid bare the conspiracy to dismantle Skyline and siphon its assets into a rival company. The silence following Thomas's revelation was shattered by Marcus's outburst. "This is ridiculous," he barked, slamming his hand on the table. "You're spinning baseless accusations, Thomas. Where's your proof?" Thomas's expression didn't waver. Everything you see here has been verified. The financial discrepancies, the shell companies, the forged documents, it's all been meticulously documented. He turned to the board members. You'll find full copies of the investigation in the folders in front of you. Amelia finally spoke, her voice icy. This is a personal attack, Thomas. You're dragging private matters into a professional setting. It's beneath you. Thomas met her gaze, his tone soft, yet firm. You made it professional when you conspired to steal from this company. Don't try to deflect now. Just as Marcus opened his mouth to respond, the door to the conference room swung open. 2 men in suits entered, their presence commanding attention. Thomas Laird? One of them asked. Right here, Thomas replied. He gestured toward Marcus and David. You'll find these men more interesting. The 2 men, federal investigators Thomas had brought into the fold weeks ago, approached Marcus and David. Marcus Trenton, David Keene, you're under investigation for corporate espionage, embezzlement, and fraud. Marcus leapt to his feet, sputtering. You can't be serious. This is a witch hunt. David, pale and trembling, didn't resist as the agents escorted him out. Marcus's protests grew louder, but they fell on deaf ears as he was led away in handcuffs. Amelia sat motionless, her composed facade cracking. Her lips trembled as she whispered, You planned this. Thomas didn't respond. He turned to the board. You'll also find my proposed contingency plans in your folders. They outline how Skyline will recover from this breach and prevent such events in the future. The board members nodded, visibly shaken but impressed by Thomas's decisiveness. When the meeting concluded, the room emptied quickly. Only Amelia and Thomas remained. She stood, smoothing her skirt, her eyes flashing with anger and fear. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You'll be receiving divorce papers by the end of the day, Thomas said evenly, and I've already instructed the legal team to ensure you have no access to my assets or the company. Her composure finally shattered. You can't do this, Thomas. You can't just cut me out like I'm nothing. You did that yourself, he replied, his tone devoid of warmth. You betrayed me, Amelia. You betrayed everything we built together. She opened her mouth to retort, but found no words. With a final look of disdain, she turned and walked out of the room. Later that evening, Thomas sat alone in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand. The events of the day replayed in his mind. The looks of shock, the accusations, the cold satisfaction of watching Marcus and David taken away. He opened his laptop, scanning the latest reports from his security team. Vertex Innovations was already in disarray, its leadership scrambling to recover from the legal and financial bombshells Thomas had dropped. Skyline's reputation remained intact, its board fully supporting his leadership. And yet, as he stared at the empty chair where Amelia once sat during their late-night conversations, a hollow ache lingered. He had won the battle, but the scars of betrayal would not heal easily. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. Thomas knew that rebuilding his life, personally and professionally, would take time. But as he finished his drink and closed his laptop, a faint smile touched his lips. The storm had passed, and Thomas Laird remained standing. Thomas Laird sat in his office as twilight fell over the city, the warm glow of the Manhattan skyline painting streaks of amber across his desk. The day had been a storm of revelations, confrontations, and decisive action. The board was behind him. Marcus Trent was facing criminal charges, and Amelia had left their home, retreating to a life that no longer intersected with his. For all his careful planning, though, there was a hollow victory in the quiet of his solitude. The night was still young, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to leave the office. His private investigator's latest report lay open on his laptop. detailing the network of shell companies Marcus and Amelia had built to funnel money into Vertex Innovations. Each transaction was like a nail hammered into the coffin of trust he'd once placed in them. The report also contained a note about someone else, Kenneth Langston, one of Nexus Solutions' top executives. Langston's name had appeared in Vertex's internal emails. It seemed the conspiracy extended farther than Marcus and Amelia. Thomas called the investigator, his voice even despite the weight of the discoveries. "I need everything you have on Kenneth Langston," he said. "Every detail, every connection. Find out how deep this goes." As he ended the call, his gaze drifted to a framed photo on his desk. It was from years ago, taken on the day he cut the ribbon on Skyline Technologies' first major project. Amelia stood beside him, radiant in a simple dress, her smile filled with pride. Marcus was there too, grinning with a hand on Thomas's shoulder. In that moment, everything had seemed possible. Now, the photo was a cruel reminder of what betrayal looked like before it revealed itself. He opened a file on his computer containing Vertex's leaked project plans. It was a brazen replication of Skyline's proprietary AI platform, dressed up with minor tweaks to mask the theft. The timeline for their launch, however, was 6 weeks earlier than Skyline's. This explained the urgency behind Marcus's sabotage. They had planned to position Vertex as the leader in the industry before Skyline could claim its rightful place. Thomas's fingers hovered over the keyboard as a new idea took shape. If Vertex wanted to launch first, perhaps they'd underestimated just how prepared he was to fight back. He began drafting a strategy that would not only undercut Vertex's launch, but expose their fraudulent operations to their investors and the public. He typed quickly, pausing only to refine key points in his approach. A knock on the door startled him. Claire stepped in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "I figured you might need this," she said, setting the mug down gently on the desk. Her eyes flicked to the open file. "Long night? Long week," he replied. He studied her for a moment, grateful for her loyalty. She had been his assistant for years, a steady presence who managed the chaos of his professional life without complaint. "Claire, do you trust me?" Her brow furrowed, but she nodded without hesitation. "Of course I do. I need you to do something for me. It's going to be risky, and you might not like what I'm about to ask." "Try me," she said, crossing her arms. He outlined the plan, a carefully orchestrated leak of Vertex's stolen code to a select group of investors and tech journalists. It was a dangerous move, one that could backfire if not executed perfectly, but it was the fastest way to destroy Vertex's credibility and derail their launch. Cleo listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to determination. "Consider it done," she said, her voice firm. "But you owe me an explanation over a very expensive dinner when this is over." As she left, Thomas felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. He wasn't fighting this battle alone, and he still had people he could trust. The next day, Thomas met with his legal team. He instructed them to file an injunction against Vertex, citing intellectual property theft and breach of contract. It was a preemptive strike designed to slow them down while he finalized his counterattack. His lawyers were skeptical at first, but as he laid out the evidence, their counterattacks grew. "We'll have the paperwork filed by the end of the day," one of them assured him. After the meeting, Thomas returned to his office to find an email from the investigator. The subject line read, "Langston connection confirmed." His heart pounded as he opened the file. Kenneth Langston wasn't just tied to Vertex. He had been instrumental in facilitating the flow of stolen assets. He had used his position at Nexus to act as a broker, ensuring the transfers went unnoticed. Thomas realized this wasn't just about Skyline or Vertex anymore. Nexus had been a trusted partner, and their involvement threatened to tarnish Skyline's reputation by association. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated. Instead of reacting immediately, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the implications. A direct confrontation with Nexus would draw attention to the broader conspiracy, potentially harming Skyline. But if he exposed Langston without implicating the company, he could sever the connection without collateral damage. He composed an email to Nexus's CEO, outlining the situation in vague terms and requesting an urgent meeting. He attached just enough evidence to get their attention, but held back the more damning details. If Nexus wanted to protect its reputation, they would deal with Langston quietly. By evening, Claire returned with an update on the leak. The selected investors and journalists had received the files, and their reactions were already pouring in. As expected, the investors were furious, demanding answers from Vertex's leadership. The journalists, meanwhile, had begun drafting stories that would hit the tech news cycle within hours. Thomas reviewed the draft articles, his lips curling into a grim smile. The headlines would be devastating for Vertex. Tech startup Vertex caught in IP theft scandal, and Skyline rival faces allegations of sabotage and fraud. By the time Vertex could respond, their reputation would be in tatters. He spent the rest of the evening preparing for the fallout. He rehearsed statements, anticipating questions from the media and investors. He called his PR team, instructing them to emphasize Skyline's commitment to integrity and innovation. Every word was carefully chosen to position Skyline as the victim of corporate espionage, a company that had risen above sabotage to continue leading the industry. As the first articles went live, Thomas received a call from Vertex's CEO. The man's voice was strained, his desperation evident. "Thomas, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." Thomas let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. "There's no misunderstanding," he said finally. "You stole from me. Now you're paying the price." The conversation ended with the Vertex CEO begging for a meeting, but Thomas wasn't interested. The damage was done, and there was no coming back from it. By midnight, Skyline's stock was rising as Vertex's plummeted. Thomas watched the numbers climb on his screen, a bittersweet sense of accomplishment settling over him. He had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Langston was still a threat, and Nexus's involvement needed to be resolved. As the city lights flickered outside his window, Thomas allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had fought hard to protect everything he had built, but the cost had been high. The scars of betrayal would linger, but he knew one thing for certain: no one would ever take advantage of him again. Thomas Laird sat at the head of Skyline Technologies' boardroom table, the glow of the early evening sun illuminating his face. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but inside the walls of Skyline, a profound stillness had taken hold. The events of the past weeks had culminated in this moment, the air thick with a tension that could snap at any second. In front of him, the board members reviewed the final documentation outlining the extent of the sabotage orchestrated by Marcus Trent, Amelia, and their associates. The silence had settled among them, broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional sharp intake of breath. "This is thorough," said Eleanor Chen, Skyline's lead investor, breaking the silence. Her tone was measured but impressed. "Thomas, you've not only managed to contain this disaster, but turned it into an opportunity for Skyline to rise above it. Thomas offered a slight nod, his face impassive. He didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The battle with Vertex and its conspirators was over, but the wounds they'd inflicted were still fresh. Marcus's betrayal, Amelia's deceit, and the involvement of Kenneth Langston had shaken the very foundation of his personal and professional life. That night, Thomas returned to the empty penthouse. It was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the city below. Amelia's absence was a strange void, a silence that echoed louder than her presence ever had. Her belongings had been removed days ago, her departure stark punctuation to their years together. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the window, staring out at the skyline he had worked so hard to shape. The city was a testament to his efforts, a sprawling tapestry of glass and steel that bore his mark. Yet the victory felt hollow. Amelia's betrayal had been more than an assault on his marriage. It was a blow to his belief in the partnerships he had once cherished. The next morning brought the first cracks in Kenneth Langston's facade. Nexus Solutions released a carefully worded statement, distancing itself from Langston and the scandal surrounding Vertex Innovations. Langston, they claimed, had acted independently, violating company policy and their code of ethics. Thomas knew better. Nexus had chosen self-preservation over loyalty, cutting ties with Langston before the fallout could spread. Still, as the public exposure of Langston's role sent ripples through the industry, investors grew wary of Nexus and their stock took a hit. For Thomas, it was a partial victory. He had removed Langston from the equation, but Nexus remained an unsteady ally. Later that day, a package arrived at Thomas's office. It was plain, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside, he found a small, nondescript USB drive and a note that read, "Consider this a final parting gift. Hey." Thomas stared at the drive for a long moment before inserting it into his laptop. The files it contained were damning. A comprehensive log of communications between Amelia and Langston, implicating not only Marcus and Vertex, but other names he hadn't uncovered yet. These were people within Skyline, Nexus, and even rival companies, all connected through a web of collusion and corruption. Amelia's final gift was a double-edged sword, a parting shot that could either dismantle her enemies or drag Thomas into another storm. Thomas called Claire into his office. She entered with her usual poise, her sharp eyes scanning his face for clues about his mood. He slid the USB across the desk. "Find out everything you can about this," he said simply. Claire raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. She nodded, taking the drive with her. "I'll keep it discreet," she said before leaving. As she exited, Thomas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Amelia's parting gesture felt calculated, her way of remaining entangled in his life even as she left it. He wondered if she had given him the drive as a peace offering or a trap. By the time Claire returned with her findings, the implications were clear. The files contained evidence of an even larger conspiracy. Rival companies had been involved in similar schemes, stealing intellectual property and undermining competitors. Amelia's betrayal, it seemed, was part of a broader network of manipulation and greed. "You could use this to take down more than just Vertex," Claire said, her tone cautious. "This is enough to start a wave of investigations across the industry, but it's risky. If this leaks, it could drag Skyline into the fray." Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let me think about it," he said. For hours, he sat in his office weighing his options. He had already taken down Vertex and exposed Marcus's betrayal, but If he acted on these files, it could spark a chain reaction that might destabilize the entire industry, and Skyline along with it. Days later, Thomas made his decision. He called a press conference, inviting key players in the tech world, journalists, and investors. The room buzzed with anticipation as he stepped onto the stage, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression composed. "I stand before you today not only as the CEO of Skyline Technologies, but as a representative of an industry that must evolve," he began. "In recent weeks, we have uncovered a disturbing pattern of sabotage, theft, and collusion within our sector. While Skyline has weathered this storm, others may not be so fortunate. This is an opportunity to rebuild trust and accountability in our industry." His words were met with applause, but he wasn't done. He announced a new initiative, an independent watchdog organization funded by Skyline to investigate corporate ethics and protect intellectual property. It was a bold move, one that positioned Skyline as a leader in transparency and integrity. After the conference, Thomas returned to his office, exhausted but resolute. He had chosen not to release the files directly, instead leveraging the knowledge they contained to pressure those implicated into compliance. It was a gamble, but one he believed would pay off. That evening, as the city lights twinkled outside his penthouse, Thomas sat alone once more. His glass of scotch reflected the dim light of his study, the liquid swirling as he contemplated the journey that had brought him here. He had survived betrayal, dismantled a conspiracy, and protected his company. But the cost had been steep. His marriage was over, his trust shattered, and his belief in those closest to him forever altered. Yet, in the quiet of the night, he felt something unfamiliar. A sense of peace. He had fought back, not just for Skyline, but for himself. He had faced the storm and emerged stronger, scarred, but unbroken. And as he raised his glass to the city below, Thomas Laird knew one thing for certain. He would never be caught unaware again.